Thanks very much, Butch, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Got to clarify a couple things though right up front. God, I would hate to have the right after the lunch spot be a suit from Ottawa, because that's 3 strikes. I'm actually from Edmonton. I was born and raised here, lived here till 1992, and when I woke up yesterday morning and saw the weather, I remembered part of the reason why I moved. Because I like to tell people in Ontario that Edmonton has 2 seasons, winter and a couple weeks where the skating's a bit sketchy on the outdoor rinks. But as an Edmontonian who lives in Ottawa, the only thing I get to enjoy about the Stanley Cup playoffs this year is that neither the Flames or the Toronto Maple Leafs are in it. But it is a real pleasure to come back here. I remember being in this hotel when it was the Edmonton Inn, and I kept going, Ramada, where the heck is that? So, but it's a real pleasure to be here. I've got about a half an hour with you this afternoon, but what I thought I would do is only talk for about 15 minutes, and then have an opportunity for some questions and some dialogue. Because while it's important to us that we get an opportunity to share with you what we're doing and some of the information that we have, it's equally important, if not more important, for us to hear back from you and to get some perspective on what we're sharing and some perspective from your organization. So if that's acceptable to you, that's the way we'll proceed. What I do want to cover off in the 15 minutes or so that I'm going to get up here and talk before I start inviting questions is a few things. I want to talk about some context for the sector, sort of some of the tough times, but certainly the brighter future that we see for the sector going forward, looking through to the end of the decade, through to 2020. I'm going to give you a little background and history on our organization, the Forest Products Sector Council, but I really want to focus most of the time on a couple of key project areas that we're involved in that really speak to the future of the sector from a labor market perspective, what the kind of demand factors are and what some of the issues and challenges are in terms of meeting that demand over the course of the next decade. And I'm going to close it off with some hopefully germane final thoughts. Looking forward, certainly when we see the outlook for a brighter future, I don't have to tell anybody in this room what kind of a difficult period that we've been through over the last several years, but certainly from everyone that we talk to across the country, everyone that we've consulted with across the country over the last year or so, most people are saying recovery is very much on the horizon if it isn't already occurring. We know that that's not a one-size-fits-all answer and that in some communities recovery is still dragging, but I think if we look across the country and look across the full spectrum of the sector, we're certainly seeing the prospects of recovery that are getting stronger on a day-to-day basis. And there's a number of things that are really underpinning that recovery. Certainly we're seeing demand for many of the traditional products that Canada produces returning and increasing, and we're seeing some surprising gains in markets like China. Certainly we think that while it's a very difficult and very tragic situation, that the recent events in Japan will have some positive impact in terms of demand for Canadian lumber. We're seeing some growth in new markets, not only in the traditional products that we've produced as a sector, but also for some of the new and emerging products and processes. We are starting to see some traction, if you will, on efforts to use Canadian wood in greater applications. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be in Quebec City and was attending a meeting in a 6-story building constructed of wood. This was an amendment, not an amendment to the building code, but architects in Quebec were able to convince the Quebec Building Code Authority to provide an exclusion to allow them to construct a 6-story building in a commercial application in wood. And I have to tell you, it's incredibly impressive and beautiful to see the wooden floors and the cross-lamb timbers that are supporting this building, and it really speaks to some of the potential that exists. And finally, we start to see things like new products and processes, biomass, bioenergy, composites really beginning to take hold in the sector. But certainly from our perspective and talking to the leadership of the sector across the country, we believe that the best prospect for the future really rests with the integration of the traditional offerings of the sector along with a transformed and new and innovative sector over the course of the next decade. A little bit about our organization, the Forest Products Sector Council. We are a relatively new group. We were established just a little less than 3 years ago and are one of 34 national industrial sector councils that each work with various industry sectors across the country. As Butch mentioned, our organization is industry-led. Our board of directors includes 15 members, 7 representatives from major forest products companies across the country, 5 representatives representatives from unions, the three major unions that are involved in the sector. We have representation from universities. Alex Drummond from the University of Alberta is a member of our board, from the community college sector, and we have a representative on our board from Aboriginal peoples. So the board that I work with and for is a group of about 15 people. And we are a very small organization. You currently have 1/3 of our staff standing in the room, and I did come alone. So we have a very small group, but we are working very closely with that board to try and move forward on some action and active plans focused on the future of the sector. All of our work is really focused in the context of the primary sector. So thinking about the sector right from silviculture through to dimensional lumber and fine paper. So that's the entire primary sector, really stopping short of the advanced wood processing or real heavy value added portions of the sector. Presentation I have for you this afternoon is really in the context of the changing need for workers across the sector in all of the various enterprises, the 8,900 odd enterprises that make up that full continuum of the primary value chain. And certainly we see that as demand returns and as the workforce ages, and looking out across the room, I basically see a similar demographic to what I see any chance I get to talk to a group in the sector, a whole lot of silver blonde hair, in some cases not so much hair, so certainly an older group, and we start to see the workforce move towards retirement, and I know we'll have a discussion a little later this afternoon about how to ease your way in there, but it's an older sector that is facing a significant attrition in terms of retirement, and we're going to have to look at ways to retain knowledge and to recruit and train new workers if we're going to meet the demands, the labor force demands of the sector between now and the next decade, and it is clearly an understatement to suggest that more workers will need to be recruited across this sector in a wide range of occupations, in a wide range of operations. And certainly as we look at a sector that is continuing to transform and continuing to evolve, and with that are associated changes in products and processes and technology, we know that that's going to have an impact on the skills and knowledge that are required by workers. And in that context, we see a strong premium being placed on literacy and computer skills and numeracy as well. So I want to focus at this point on a piece of research, on one of our projects that we call a sector study. And it struck me as I was just looking through the deck at lunch that if there was ever an Ottawa word, sector study absolutely has to be it, because it's probably only in Ottawa would we come up for a word that would take up 2 years of time and research across the country. But essentially the sector study is a foundational piece for us. It's really the basis for our work as a council, and really I would suggest to the industry and to the sector at large. It really is going to help us develop the empirical and scientific basis of information that we need to develop projects and plans going forward. Now, what the study will really give us is a profile of future workforce demand needs, including numbers of workers, by region, by subsector, some insight into the knowledge and skills and training needs of those workers. What kind of knowledge, what kind of skills are those workers going to have in order to be a successful part of this sector in the future? It's also going to focus on critical and emerging occupations. What kind of occupations, what are the occupational mixes that are going to be most in demand over the course of the next decade? We'll also look at the need for changing occupations in terms of as a result of industry restructuring, technological changes, and a range of economic scenarios and projections. And finally, because we don't want this to simply be a research study that looks really nice on shelves and does a really good job of gathering dust, we want to develop a set of conclusions and a path forward to really give us some insight as to what we begin to need to do to respond to the issues and challenges that are identified in the research. One of the sort of cornerstone pieces of this study is a bit around forecasting future labor force demand. And in order to do that, we completed a scenario planning exercise. And to do that, we engaged the Conference Board of Canada and some other labor market economists to really develop 4 projections of future labor force demand based on the influence of a number of key factors. So we looked at a number of key factors that really drive activity and really drive employment within the sector across the country and in the various regions regions across the country. So obviously we looked at housing starts in both the U.S. and domestic markets, looking at different projections through to the end of the decade. We looked at GDP and productivity rates for Canada versus the rest of the world. We looked at exchange rates and general trade and market conditions, recognizing how much of our production is actually destined for the export market. We looked at market expansion, prospects for various levels of market expansion, not only for the traditional products that we produce as a sector and as an industry, but for some of the new and emerging products and processes that are being produced and developed by the sector. And finally, we looked at technological advancements. Again, not only for the traditional products and process mixes, but some of these new and emerging aspects of the sector. And in doing that, we end up with a set of 4 projections. Just to quickly run through them, we start off with a green projection, which is our most optimistic projection, and it is predicated on a significant recovery in U.S. housing and a significant increase in recovery of demand for the traditional products produced by the sector. It's also predicated on continued expansion in international markets for Canadian products, again, for existing, traditional, and new and emerging products. And finally, it's predicated on aggressive implementation of new products and processes. Second set of projections is a blue projection, still an optimistic projection. Includes good recovery in U.S. housing, moderate expansion, so a little less aggressive expansion in terms of markets for Canadian products, and continuing, albeit a little bit slower, implementation of new products, processes, and technology. Finally, the third scenario is a brown projection that includes milder recovery, but still good recovery in U.S. housing. Slower expansion into new markets and slower introduction of newer products and processes. And finally, we have a red projection, which of course is the least optimistic, and I really would characterize as a worst case scenario. And it really incorporates a very, very limited recovery in U.S. housing, minimal market expansion for Canadian products across the world, and the prospect of a double dip in the U.S. economy over the course of the next couple years, and another recessionary slowdown by the end of the decade. So it really gives you a range of options from a very optimistic set of projections to, frankly, a very pessimistic set of projections. And what that has resulted in is some forecast in terms of total employment demand for the sector at large, so all of those 5 subsectors across the country. So if you look at the top there, you see a green projection line that forecasts demand to continue to increase right through to the end of the decade, although a little bit more slowly towards the latter part of the decade. The blue projection, a little less optimistic, good growth through to the middle part of the decade in terms of demand, with a flattening out towards the end of the decade, but still certainly finishing strongly in the last year or two. Brown scenario, a bit of a slowdown now with a flat growth, but good growth throughout the end of the decade. And a red scenario that is kind of a bumpy road, if you will. You see the double dip very strongly represented in the early part of the decade, and the prospect of the slowdown showing up in the latter part of the decade. What is really significant about this graph, and really begins to drive the issue home, is that bottom line. And that's the attrition line. And that really looks at the current workforce and forecasts how many of those people will leave the sector due to retirement or due to attrition to other industries over the course of the next decade. And that number amounts to about 50% of our current workforce. So if you look in the red scenario, that suggests that even in a worst case scenario across the sector, we're going to have to recruit somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 new workers across this sector, across the country, over the next decade. And in the most optimistic set of projections, that number increases to more around the area of 120,000. So you see the task and the challenge facing us in terms of meeting future labor force demand is quite significant, because again, even in the worst case scenario, it's a significant number of new workers that will be required across the sector, across the country by the end of 2020. And you also see that the pressure really starts to become intense around 2015. So we did the same thing for the prairies. Now what's interesting about these sets of numbers is overall growth in all 4 projections in the prairies, of which Alberta is the lion's share of the employment, is better and stronger than the national numbers. The green pace of growth is stronger, the blue pace of growth is stronger, the brown pace of growth is stronger, and in the red set of projections, which is actually sort of a break-even point, if you will, across the country, even in the red, we see growth. So in all four projections, even in the worst-case projection, we see growth in net demand for employment across the sector in the prairies by the end of the decade. And again, we overlay that lovely purple line that shows that 30% reduction down to a base in the sector of about 10,000 workers by the end of 2020. And you begin to see the magnitude of the demand. We're seeing a demand for just under 10,000 new workers, additional workers, by the end of the decade in a worst-case scenario, and as many as 22,000 by the end of the decade in the most optimistic set of projections. So certainly the task ahead of us is quite significant on a flat-out numerical basis. And looking around the room and seeing how many of you are actually working outside of the sector really, I think, underscores the challenge that we face as well. So what are some of the key HR challenges for the sector? Certainly meeting future demands for labor is significant. It is probably the single most significant challenge we face as a sector. And underpinning that is issues in terms of recruitment, getting new workers to come into the sector to meet the replacement demand and the projected growth in employment that we see over the next decade, and retention of existing workforce, and overcoming losses due to migration to other sectors and turnover due to retirement. You know, losing people to the oil patch consistently presents some major challenges for us as a sector, and certainly when we start looking at people that will leave the sector and move into retirement, that's a major issue for us going forward. Second piece is not only in terms of meeting the numbers of bodies, but also making sure that those bodies have the skills and knowledge they require to be part of a successful sector in the future. And certainly that underscores some challenges in terms of skills development to meet the demands of the industry in the face of continuing transformation, but also some issues around knowledge transfer, helping to make sure that the knowledge and skills of older workers are better transferred to newer entrants and some of the younger workers within the sector. Here's some key factors that are challenges for us going forward. A little bit different in this room, but certainly when we look across the sector, we see a sector that is predominantly male. It's 85% male across the sector, across all the occupations. We see a sector where 17% of the workforce has less than a high school diploma, and you compare that to 12% for the labor market as a whole, and that speaks to issues in terms of the ability to take on new technology and new processes where higher levels of literacy and numeracy are required. Now, on the other side of the coin, 39% of our workforce has post-secondary certification, and in that I include apprenticeship training, compared to 35% for all industries. So we do have a highly skilled workforce as well. But probably the most significant factor in terms of this slide is the age of the sector's workforce. We're older than average, and as a result, about 1/3 or about 50,000 of our workers will retire by 2020, and this compares to about 20% if you look at the workforce as a whole. And finally, in terms of key factors, the whole issue around workforce skills requirements and the increase in those areas due to industry transformation, technological advancement, mechanization, and so on. Graphically, really speaks to some of the age banding. You see the forest products sector across the country represented by the blue bar, and you see that significant increase above the total labor force in that 45 to 54 and 55 and above. And also you see the much lower numbers of younger workers that are in our sector. So again, that really speaks to some of the challenges we face, not only from a retention and attrition perspective, but from a recruitment perspective. So I've shared with you today some of the preliminary findings and some of the top-level findings from this study. We've identified a number of key issues, we've identified a number of challenges, but we've also identified a number of opportunities. And we are pulling that together into a final summary report, including the conclusions, including some next steps that will be released next month, May 11th, at the 24th Annual Global Forest Conference in Vancouver, the Price Waterhouse event. And at that event and on that day, copies of the summary summary report will be available in hard copy or for download at our website at www.fpsc-cspf.ca. So I would encourage you, if you're not in Vancouver for the event, to download the research summary document on May 11th, because it'll really provide much greater insight and much greater perspective than what time has allowed me to share with you today. Another project area, and I'll very quickly go through this because, again, I do want to have some opportunity for questions, and I'm mindful that the carbs lunch is probably you're probably into the carb lull right about now, and the caffeine is not quite kicked in, so we'll move forward through this fairly quickly. One of the things when we look at the future demands for the workforce and the future technological needs for the workforce, we recognize that we're going to need to increase the presence and the participation of people working in regulated and formally certified occupations, and certainly that would include your group, but we're also including in that group professional foresters as well as apprenticeable occupations and tradespeople, because when we look at our projections for labor force demand, some of our strongest pressure points are in those areas. We also know that formal training and certification can help increase mobility, employment stability for workers during ebb and flow times, and ultimately improve the image of the sector. And I know I'm certainly preaching to the converted when I talk about the role that professions can play in terms of improving the image of an industry. Our sector study, as I say, points to concerns and challenges in terms of the demand for these workers, and we're really focusing our efforts on how do we increase the participation within the sector in apprenticeship and regulated occupations. At this point, we're very early in the research stage, and we'll be releasing a research report and strategy in the fall of 2011. So once again, I would invite you to pay close attention to our website over the course of the coming months, when we'll be providing some information that we think will be of interest to you individually and certainly to your organization going forward. I think if we, a couple of statements, if I can, the challenges facing the sector over the next decade in terms of meeting our future HR needs are varied and they're complex. These are not simple issues. They're not simple challenges, and frankly, there's no simple answers. We recognize our role as an organization. We're a national organization, but we see the work that we're doing as simply an additional set of tools, an additional set of insight for the sector. And we strongly believe that no one group or one single set of initiatives can be expected to impact the kind of change that's going to be needed in order to meet the future labor force needs of the sector going forward. And in that vein, we will be looking to partner and collaborate with other organizations and other groups that are focused on future HR needs for the sector going forward. And just some final thoughts. As I opened up and suggested, we still don't see recovery in each and every community, but I must say that compared to 3 years ago, where all we read were bad headlines, we read a whole lot more good headlines now than we ever did before. Overall indications suggest that we're well placed as a nation and as a sector to profit from future demands for forest products. But we're going to capitalize on those opportunities. We're going to have a continuing need for highly educated and highly skilled workers, particularly in the technical and trades-based disciplines. I had an opportunity to talk to a group of industry employers not that long ago, and I said to them, gentlemen, it's really important to recognize that you can have the best mills in the world, you can have the best fiber in the world, and you can have access to markets. But if you don't have the people to go to work, you're simply not going to be able to realize the potential. So it really is about having the right people with the right skills at the right place and time if we're going to realize the promise of the future. And with that, I will, somewhat late, but not too bad, welcome any questions, comments, or suggestions you might have. And thank you very much for your attention and again for the opportunity to be here. Go ahead. I don't know if are you going to yell up, stand up and yell? Or?
I'll stand up.
And,
I'm just curious, what age were you using for your retirement? Was it 55, 60, 65?
what we did was we actually looked at the past retirement patterns for all occupations within the sector. We cross-checked that with a number of data sources, including actual retirement information from a number of pension plans. We retire younger in this sector than most. It's around 57, 58 on average. A little older in some places, a little younger in others, but if you're looking across the country, it's 57, 58. And I can see guys doing the math in there going, hang on, I'm awful close.
I just just got one,
Are we on?
Yep.
Okay, just one question about, over in BC, we've seen them really get hit hard by the pine beetle. They've increased their cuts significantly to try to deal with that. And in a couple of years, with all that increased wood, increased production, increased manpower and everything to deal with that, in a couple of years, we're going to see that all fall off. How much do you think that's going to affect? Is that just a blip, or is it going to be pretty? I think it'll be pretty significant in BC, and of course, we're going to experience some of that here.
Yeah. In fact, if I were to show you the BC slide, you see the impact of bug kill hugely. Because after the middle of the decade, if you looked at the prairie slide, you still see some mild growth. Actually, you see decline in all projections in British Columbia across the sector. If we look at, there's some stark regional differences. For instance, another example I'll give you is pulp and paper in Quebec, where the decline in pulp and paper in Quebec is markedly stronger or markedly worse than every other region in the country because of the presence and the prevalence of newsprint in that market. So certainly we see some regional differences, and certainly the impact of pine beetle on British Columbia's employment demand is significant, and we see it in our results. That said, though, even in that scenario, they're still going to need some relatively significant numbers, not the kinds of numbers on a percentage basis that we see here in the prairies, but certainly are going to need some numbers. They still have the older workforce, and they're still going to lose the people due to retirement and attrition, and even replacing them is going to present some challenges. One of the first places I presented this was actually at a group of BC employers, and the numbers in the red were quite depressing, I guess, if you can say that. And I said, and you could almost see them sort of relax and say, okay, we're going to be okay. And then I overlay the 30% retirement attrition numbers, and it becomes really stark. And it's not as big a percentage as what we see here, but it's still a significant enough percentage to warrant attention.
does the report break down I don't know if I want to call it skill, but the diploma degree sector of the workforce versus the sort of equipment operator in-mill employees? Does it analyze how that's looking? Because I suspect it's a lot worse where a lot of the schools are closing. There's got to be a real shortfall.
What we have is, for each of the set of projections, we have demand projections for the top 20 occupations. So looking at the top 20 occupations across the sector, in terms of numbers of workers, we'll be able to say that in a green projection in the prairies, the estimate is that we'll need X number of more of this occupation over the course of the next decade. We are somewhat limited in terms of the data. In some cases, we can get really, really granular. For instance, we can tell you how many millwrights, for instance. But some of the classification systems that are used, we have this great big lump of laborers in pulp and paper. Well, anybody who's been in a paper mill knows that that's not just a simple homogeneous group, but the data that's available from StatsCan is sort of putting that together as a homogeneous group. So yes, we'll have some very occupational specific stuff in terms of this study, but we're also going to have some gaps. Forestry professionals is kind of lumped together as well, and so that speaks to sort of some lumping together that doesn't necessarily serve our purpose as well going forward. And in fact, one of the next steps, one of the recommendations that we're going to be advancing is a suggestion that we need to be able to get some labor market projection systems that are really more reflective of the way the sector does business, the way the sector hires, trains, recruits, retains, because what's out there right now doesn't necessarily meet our needs.
A couple short questions, I guess. One would be that here in Alberta, the Alberta Forest Products Association has started up a Work Wild program in order to get the message out and try to recruit workers. So my first question is there anything happening kind of more at a national level from the Forest Products Sector Council in that regard? And my second question is kind of related to that, is whether or not you're showing us a lot of the problems, but what's happening on the solution end? So is there any other discussions happening at a national level with the forestry education institutions to help resolve some of this?
That's about a three-part question. So let me try to give you a simple answer to it. Yes, we're aware of Work Wild that has been developed. There's other programs like that. GoForestry.com out in New Brunswick. One of the recommendations that again we'll be focusing on is developing some cohesive national materials that really present the sector and the wide range of occupations to the broadest possible audience in a really cohesive and consistent way to really fight your way through the noise. One of the challenges in terms of promoting careers in a sector is that it's a really crowded landscape. There's a lot of messaging that's going out there, and getting some consistency and standardization of message does an awful lot to improve that. So in fact, one of the recommendations, one of the next steps that we will be proposing is really focused on developing some national level initiatives on that. In terms of the post-secondary schools, I'm really not in a position to speak to that because I don't know what's going on. The announcement out of the University of Toronto a couple weeks ago was extremely frustrating for many in the sector. You start looking at the enrollment numbers, and it really speaks to the magnitude of the challenge we're facing, particularly when we look at the demand. I know that the universities, talking to the universities, they're very excited to be receiving these numbers and being able to see them, because they're then able to go back and say, there is a future, there is a need, this is not a sunset industry. And in fact, cutting seats at this time is actually not in the interest of the sector and in the industry of the interests of the industry going forward. But as to what they're going to do, how they're going to respond, I think it's a major challenge. One of the meetings I was in yesterday, they were talking about cuts to funding to post-secondary in this province, and that's going to be a significant challenge for the institutions to juggle when they're looking at how do they allocate their budgets in the best way possible. And the short answer is there isn't a short answer.
Everybody all right?
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. It was a real pleasure. As I say, a month from now, we'll have a bit more fulsome story to tell, and would certainly encourage you, if you don't happen to be in Vancouver for that event, check our website out on the 11th of May, download a copy or send us an email, and we'll send you a copy, and look forward to working with you on a go-forward basis. So again, thanks very much.